Welcome back to the ES6 video series. In this video we'll be covering promises. So the basic concept of a promise is something I'm going to introduce now. It's something you'll probably be very familiar with once we get into the Angular world and start making service calls, but I wanted to cover it now as opposed to later. So a promise is an expected result of an asynchronous operation. The most common scenario for this promise is the eventual return of an HTTP call to a server. The promise is a placeholder object that represents that operation and the future of that response. So promises are allowed for the application to continue processing and execute a predefined callback for a successful or error scenario in the completion of that operation. So the promise is executed similar to that of a try-catch finally block. The basic syntax of a promise is as follows. The promise constructor takes a callback function to determine the success and to perform the asynchronous function call. It is passed a resolve and reject function to let the remainder of the code know whether or not it was successful. So here's the construction of a new promise. Again, it's new promise with a callback containing two parameters, resolve and reject. The resolve function is used to represent a successful operation. The first parameter passed to this resolve function gets sent to the successful callback of the promise. The reject function is the same concept, but it does the error portion of a asynchronous operation. An empty promise body is not very useful. It never resolves or rejects, and nothing in the promise lifecycle is executed other than the construction of the object. So in this operation here, it will never execute the resolve or the reject of the then block. So it's not very useful unless you have a set and forget kind of thing. But even then, if you're not resolving or rejecting, there's no point in really surrounding it in a promise. The then function takes two parameters, a success callback and an error callback. The first parameter is executed on success, the second on error. Neither is necessarily required, but using them without any parameters will not perform anything on the resolution of the promise, aka when the asynchronous operation is completed, nothing will be executed after that. So here we have a new promise being created. Inside of that we would determine whether or not to resolve or reject it and call the right function depending on the scenario. But in either case we provided two callbacks, the success and error. In the first case we log success with the data, and in the second case we log an error occurred with the error that had occurred and been passed to that error callback. Next we're going to cover the finally function. Finally is performed after the promise has gone through the full chain of resolve functions. It is executed regardless of success or failure. So if you have multiple .then functions and put a .finally at the end of those, regardless of whether or not it resolved or rejected, it'll execute the finally block. This is handy for setting up objects that need to exist regardless of the state of the promise, or for cleaning up resources that may have been created during the promise. Promise chaining is something that we'll be using very heavily. The then method returns another promise to the next function. Therefore, if there is a multi-step process to be performed based on a given result, it can be split into multiple parts. An example of this is making a service call and then using something inside the response of that service to then call a second service. So here we have an example. The new promise is created, and on that promise we have a function that says if data.success, return data, otherwise reject the promise. We then chain another .then on it and say console.log successfully resolved data. And in the error case, we say console.error failure occurred. So what this step is performing is saying if the resolve function was actually a valid promise and we determined that the service call was performed successfully, we can still take the response and determine that it was actually an error case. Let's say the data was invalid. So we can manually force one side or the other of that block. So it's possible to return another promise within the then block of the promise. The next then of the chain will wait until that promise is resolved to continue the promise chain. So here we have a promise that resolves the string hello world. We then output that string and return a new promise that we resolve then, it's nice to meet you. You can see in the second then, it logs the it's nice to meet you portion. And if you were to execute this, you would see hello world, it's nice to meet you. If you were to surround, let's say, the resolve function in a timeout and call that a second later, you would see that second string pop up a second later in the second then function. You can programmatically reject and resolve in a then block. Within a then block, you can force the route of the resolution of the promise by returning either an already successfully resolved promise to the next handler or an already rejected promise. This is done by returning a promise.resolve or a promise.reject. These are static functions on the promise object. So here's an example where we check the is successful property on the data response and resolve the name or reject if the name or if the call wasn't successful. In the case of it being successful, we log hello name, and in the case of it being an error, we say I don't know your name. Lastly, we'll cover promise.all. Promise.all is used to manage multiple promises in one promise chain. It will wait until all promises have been resolved to perform the then callbacks. If even one promise fails, they all enter the reject portion of the promise chain. Only the data from the first rejected promise is passed into the rejection handler. Here you can see an instance of promise.all being used to handle an array of promises, which we create in the getPromise function declared at the beginning there. So it'll iterate over the collection 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and create a new promise for each of those elements. They then resolve in the .then call of the promise.all call. Since all of them resolve automatically here, we'll output each and every one of those. Had any of them rejected, nothing would happen because I didn't define an error callback. So hopefully the concept of promises is something that you can familiarize yourself with. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, you'll become very, very familiar with them once we start dealing with service calls. I hope you enjoyed the video and look forward to seeing you in the next one.